Good morning. Come on. There we go. So I attended last year also, and I thought from Trek's example that I had to bring a prop hat also. Is that? No, you didn't, so maybe I didn't have to. But here we go. I'm going to be talking about balancing sort of technical and business concerns when you make the decision about how to package your app for mobile devices. So I've got two hats that I wear at my job, my coder hat and my CEO hat. So depending on what topic I'm talking about, I may put the hat back on, or I may not. Quick show of hands before we get going. Who currently uses Corber to build your Ember app for mobile devices, iOS and Android? 2, 3, 4. Okay, so very few. And most of you should be, which is the point of my talk. So thanks for coming. If you only remember one thing, let it be this slide, and then you can go get snacks or go to Slack or whatever it is. Unless you have a large and sustainable development budget, so criteria 1, and you're competing in a market where the user is the buyer, right, so the person making the choice about whether or not to use your service is also the person using it, and where there's significant competition and feature parity. So unless those 4 attributes are true, you should probably be building your mobile app using Ember and publishing it to Corber, or publishing it to iOS and Android via Corber. And my goal is to explain why based on the experience that we've had at my company, XBE. So a bit of an outline about what I'll go through. So first, after introducing myself and my company, I'll talk about the situation we were in a couple of years ago when we decided to build a hybrid mobile-first app using Corber, what our goal was, the objective, the options that we considered when making this decision, the exact decision that we did make, the development process that we went through to take our Ember app and build it for mobile devices using Corber, how that worked out, and maybe what the implications are for us and for others. And given that my talk is largely about how you have to consider your context when making decisions, I thought I'd put 7 asides in about the business that we're in, which is supporting the horizontal construction industry, mostly asphalt pavement. So you'll learn, minimally, you'll learn 7 things you probably didn't know about asphalt pavement in the process. So do you know anything about asphalt pavement? So we'll see. So, okay, well, there's me. I am I wasn't a proud Gen Xer when they came up with the term Gen X, but I think I've sort of graduated into feeling some pride about it. So born in 1977, in my early 40s, I've lived in a lot of places. Currently live right here in Chicago, down in the South Loop, by way of many cities on the East Coast. Married to Theresa, who's in the picture there with me. Have 5 kids, a girl, 2 boys, and 2 girls that are twins. I'm an avid runner and cyclist, though my running has been curtailed a decent amount by a heel injury that I am in denial about. I'm an NBA fan of the whole league, but Steph Curry in particular. Now, this aside seems like it's unrelated, but it's not. So I was tall early. Now, you can see I'm not tall late, so what's up with that? But at 13, I was the same height as I am right now. So what a disappointment to myself and others. So I was convinced I was going to be tall. Now, mind you, my father is 5'8". He's probably shorter than that now as age has sort of reduced his stature. But 5'8", and my mother is maybe 5 foot, maybe. So at 13, I'm 5'10", thinking, ha ha ha, I've got it made. It didn't go past that, though. And I didn't start to program until I was 33. And I'm convinced that these 2 things are related. I've become convinced recently. Because I think if you're tall young, you kind of enter denial about your actual height when you're older. So I had the mindset of a tall person until I was I don't know, mature enough to accept that that wasn't going to be the way that it worked out. And I think that about that time, my early 30s, I also sort of admitted, okay, I actually burn other people out, and I'm nerdy, and kind of don't mind spending tons of time at the computer. So anyways, I blame being tall early on my late maturation as it relates to my interest in programming. And I'm the founder and CEO of XBE, the company that sort of is behind the example I'm going to talk about. So a little bit about XBE. We're in the horizontal construction software business. So first little factoid, horizontal construction is the sort of industry lingo for things like roads and bridges and trenches and foundations, anything, you guessed it, that's about the horizontal sort of world. Vertical construction are buildings. So anything that comes up off the ground is what people call vertical construction. We're in the horizontal construction business. We primarily build software that help companies that build roads and maintain our sort of physical infrastructure, manage their work from planning to execution, analysis, and continuous improvement. We also provide, recently, just started to do this, provide material science solutions, mostly around the chemistry related to asphalt pavement. And because our software supports it, we also do truck brokering, but that's sort of an aside. I conceived of the business in 2016 and founded it in 2017. There were 11 of us. One other that's here, Benjamin Fleischer, if you don't know him, is in the second row. 11 people, 5 programmers if you include me, and we're split between various places in the US and India. Now, I put a little bit about stats on how much work we've done, mainly to provide some context about the decision that we made with respect to the hybrid app. So as of today, we've managed something around 52,000, maybe a bit more than this, 52,000 driver days. That's like guys driving in dump trucks, moving dirt and asphalt and stone and whatnot around. Around 1,600 drivers use our app to coordinate their work with their customers and employers. We've moved, I can't believe this number is true, but we've moved 10 million, or we've coordinated the movement of about 10 million tons of material between the plants and quarries and the job sites that they're used at. And again, I mentioned the kind of work that we're supporting, paving, excavation underground, and et cetera. So all of that work is supported on the front end by a single large Ember app that is hybrid, so it's deployed to browsers via typical means, and then to iOS and Android devices via the app stores through packages that are built with Corber. We're up to date, so we're on Ember 3.12, and the back end is a Rails API. So a quick aside about this. I don't know how one describes how big an app is, because I wrote this large app, and I don't know what metrics are reasonable to describe how large an app is, and I don't think these are good metrics either. But since I counted them, I'm going to share. It's like 500 and something routes, maybe closer to 600 routes. I think it's 186 models, 3,900 commits. So I don't know how big that is, but it's not small. And it's part of the context that made this decision, I think, both obvious in some ways, but definitely important. Oh, well, obligatory screenshots, so there you are. Okay, first aside about asphalt pavement. So what is asphalt pavement? Could anyone in the room describe accurately what asphalt pavement is, do you think?
I think I drive on.
That's true. So asphalt pavement is really a very simple idea. It's an aggregate that's a rocky, some sort of a dry structure, and a binder, that's the glue that'll stick together the hard parts, and that's mixed together and compacted. So that's all that asphalt pavement is. The asphalt part is asphalt cement. That's the sludgy part, which I'll talk about in a minute, that's at the bottom of the oil refinery process, and jagged stones that are usually pretty small, about that big. The asphalt's heated up, mixed with the stones, laid down hot, and then compacted with the rollers to get rid of the air voids, and that gives it its structure. That's what asphalt pavement is. And it covers an enormous portion of the world's roads. Okay, so what was the situation that we were in? So and the reason I'm setting it up this way is that I think that often, and the reason I want to give this talk, is that oftentimes programmers have opinions about whether or not you should build native apps, like as in with Xcode or with Android Studio, or build a hybrid app using a web framework like Ember that then gets published. or converted into the native build with Corber, they have opinions about whether you should do so before they know anything about the situation that you're in. And you cannot possibly give the right advice about whether or not you should go hybrid unless you know the context in which you're making that decision. So here's our context. So first, we have a diverse user base. I mentioned 1,600 drivers. We probably have about the same number of non-driver users. That's foremen in the field, or people at asphalt plants up in the tower, or CFO back at the office, or accountants, or dispatchers. So it's all sorts of people using our apps on all sorts of devices. So about half the use, give or take, is on mobile devices, phones particularly. Even that is spread between new and old iPhones, new and very old Android devices. A lot of iPads are used by people like foremen, those that work in the construction crews in the field. Some management only use iPads. And then, of course, computers for, desktop computers for the balance, maybe about a quarter of the user base. So the user base is diverse in terms of the context in which they use our software and the kind of devices that they use it on. The software has broad and deep functionality, so it's as I mentioned with the routes, a really big surface area, and some of it's kind of straightforward CRUD, and some of it is very domain specific and kind of complicated. So it's broad and deep, and I say that because it would be quite a bit to maintain in multiple apps. It's a bootstrap small team, so I started the business, mostly funded the business. As of today, there are only 4 or 5 people that develop at all, and along the way, that was either that number or less. So a small team without a gigantic pocketbook to make it larger. We have location-centric requirements, so this is going to come up in a big deal later. So our business is about people and places and the coordination of movement of materials and equipment across time. And so we have to know where people are for some functionality to be possible. And that was a requirement. And again, that sort of ties our hands with respect to whether or not we have mobile apps. There's a user-buyer dichotomy. So the people that decide to buy our software are not the users mostly. So in other words, the person that owns the vertically integrated contractor may decide to use us, and then his or her employees and their contractors and all the rest end up having to use us sort of from a compulsory standpoint. They're not making the choice themselves. And I think that that's actually pretty important. When you have compulsory usage, you can frankly make choices that are a little bit more about your convenience and quality and a little bit less about bells and whistles. Okay, so what is asphalt cement? So I mentioned that asphalt pavement is made of 2 things. It's the asphalt cement, that's that sticky tar-like substance, and aggregate, usually small jagged rocks. So this is asphalt cement. You may have heard of it, if you were in the 1800s, you would have heard of it referred to as bitumen. Sometimes now you'll hear it, like there's a contractor in Minnesota called Bituminous Roadways, and that's why they're called that. You'll hear it called pitch sometimes. It's actually it's within the classification of materials that are called pitch, and sometimes tar. So asphalt cement does exist in nature. So the tar pits that you would have heard about in elementary school that like dinosaur fossils were found in, the La Brea tar pits, that's really asphalt. That's what are the naturally occurring version of asphalt. This experiment, does anyone know what this experiment is? It's pretty well known. This is the pitch drop experiment. And so when you're taught, you may have heard about this because when a teacher is explaining viscosity to students, this is a famous experiment where the teacher said even some things that move very slowly because they have high viscosity are still a liquid. And so it's called the pitch drop experiment because pitch, or asphalt cement, was the extremely high viscosity material that was used to make the point. So the way this experiment goes is I don't remember the guy's name, unfortunately, which is bad on me. So that's not the original guy, but the original guy that did the experiment, he filled this glass funnel with pitch, waited a while until it settled down, and then cut off the bottom of the funnel so it could drip down. and then they measured the time between the pitch dropping to the bottom of the beaker. And it's about 10 years per drop. So this started going about 90 years ago, I think the early 1900s, and I think they're on pitch drop number 9 as of now, and it's still going. It's the world's longest continuously running experiment, which is pretty cool. And there's, you know, web page, all the things you'd imagine. There's a webcam that focuses on it. Yeah, if you're bored, you know. So anyways, that's what asphalt cement is. It's this high viscosity, sludgy material that is either made from the refinement of petroleum, and it's the bottom part of the process, or it could be found in nature. It's been used since the dawn of time for waterproofing and binding substances. Okay, back to us. So our objective. And again, when you're making the decision about how to get your app into the hands of users that are using phones, you have to know the context first, and you have to know what your objective is before you can make the decision about whether or not to build native apps or go hybrid. So here was our objective, and it was pretty clear at the time. First, we were trying to maximize leverage. So I started the business, run it, own it, and you know, only have limited resources. And my goal is to get the most output from the least effort, right? So I want to take the thing that we own as a business and be able to leverage that for as much benefit as I possibly can. And that's sort of obvious to say, almost to the point of making it not worth saying, except I don't know that engineering teams always make decisions with this objective in mind, which is we are trying to create leverage for our organizations and for ourselves. I had 2 constraints. The team had 2 constraints that we were worried about. One, and constraints, of course, are things we can't violate with the decision. So number one thing we couldn't violate is we had to be able to track the location of users in real time in a way that was battery efficient. So that was a must. That had to be possible. And 2, it had to fit within the budget that we had because I didn't want to raise money in advance of having all of this built out. So those were our 2 constraints, and our objective was to maximize leverage. And so when we built options and compared, should we build, you know, native iOS and native Android and then native web all separately or not, we were going to sort of evaluate those options through this lens. Okay, back to our asides. What is the most recycled product in the world? I really like this aside. It is, and this is not well known, asphalt. So 80% of the asphalt that you see milled off the roads, so see this machine, which you've seen on roads and highways before, that's called a milling machine. And what it has on the bottom is this wheel with teeth on it that grind up the road to a specific depth. So say they're grinding to 2 inches. And it sprays water to sort of keep the heat down, grinds it up, and then it shoots it out the top into a dump truck. The majority of road work that's done is called a mill and overlay. So there's an existing road down first. That road has cracking and straining and has been weathered over time. The average lifespan of a given pavement is on average about 12 years. It can be as high as, say, 18 or as low as 8, depending on what the freeze-thaw cycle is of wherever the pavement exists. So anyhow, this is the mill part of the mill overlay. And 80% of the milled asphalt that is taken off the road is recycled back into a future road. Now, there's a cool aside on that, which is that it's not just that what they call the black rock, that's the name for the recycled asphalt pavement or RAP that comes out of this. It's not just that the black rock is used as aggregate, because if you looked at it, it looks like little rocks, just like if you looked at the road crushed up. But in fact, remember, the asphalt pavement is the combination of the asphalt cement, that binder, and the aggregate, those little stones. But unlike concrete, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's not a chemical process that makes asphalt. It's more like a physical process of mixing it up and compressing it, but it's not a reaction that produces a new material. Actually, it's still just the rock and the asphalt, cement. So you can not just recycle the asphalt as an aggregate itself, but you can apply heat and additives, so chemicals, to undo some portion of that process. Take what was separate components, the binder and the rock, stick them together, and then basically unstick them, so you have to use less asphalt cement in the future. Anyhow, 80%, by far the most recycled product in the world. And in fact, the survey that showed that listed 9 commonly recycled products and asked people to rank which ones they thought proportionately were recycled the most, and people thought that asphalt was the least recycled. So you are not those people, no. All right, so what were our options? So we created 4 options that we considered when making this decision. So the first was we could have our mobile-first web app, which we had a version of at the time, and augment it with a couple of separate native tracking apps. So tracking we primarily need for the drivers that are using our software, so guys that are driving dump trucks mainly. So we thought, okay, we could have the main XBE app, the one that they use mostly and all the other people I mentioned before use, but that for location tracking, we could have a separate app, which is like a beacon app that says, okay, when you're on the clock, you have to run this app in the background so we can track where you are. I said, okay, if we did that, we thought we could do that within our development budget, and it mostly would leverage our existing software, so that seemed good. And it would meet the constraint of providing a way to track in the background someone's location. So it got on the list as a possibility. The second is to have a single rule them all app that's mobile first, hybrid out to all the devices, that is just the same app that you run in your browser but running as an iPhone or iOS device. This is obviously the one that we go with, but the other 2 that we considered were multiple native apps with feature parity, and shockingly to me, this is the default choice of many companies. So right, we're going to have a web app, we're going to have an iOS app, we're going to have an Android app. Allegedly, they're going to stay in sync. Yeah, they do not stay in sync. Spoiler alert for those that have not experienced this. But that's the idea, and you can see why this is so appealing. Because if you aren't willing to accept the downside, it's all upside. If you're like, well, every device then will have software that's built to take advantage of its native capabilities written in its SDK, which will be more performant than the rest, which is all true. I mean, the problem is you better have a pretty big budget, a pretty big team, and that better stay true for a long time. And then the last one is we could have gone mobile web only. And that was non-viable. Oh, so back to 3 for a second. So for XBE, number 3 wasn't viable because I didn't have the money to do it. And I was like aware enough of what it would cost to do it well to make that choice. I think it's tougher when you're in a venture-backed company or a larger company that does at least possibly have the budget to do it. You can trick yourself into thinking that you'll always have the budget to do it, or that that's the highest leverage move. In our case, that didn't happen, not necessarily because we were smarter, but because I just didn't have the budget to do it. So we ruled it out as being too expensive. Number 4, mobile web only, we went with for a while. But it was non-viable because we needed to add background location tracking. That was a strict requirement. We didn't have a way around it. We had to do it, and you cannot do that via a mobile web app. There's no way. You can do foreground location tracking, and it'll destroy the battery pretty well, but you could do it. But we had to enable background because the drivers have to run other things for navigation and communication in the foreground of their phones. So those were our options. And again, even if number 3 was viable, it would have scored poorly in the end because of its poor leverage, though I don't know that everyone would always agree with that. Okay, trivia fact number 4. So how far does asphalt travel on average from the plant at which it's made to the road or parking lot at which it's laid? And I've got the answer up here. People always guess over this number by a lot. So the average distance the asphalt travels is 13 miles. That's it. Which means that there are an awful lot of asphalt plants, right? Because if the average distance between the plant and the road is 13 miles, they've got to be everywhere, which is in fact true. So when you're driving from now on, keep your eye up, and you'll see probably somewhat near a highway these facilities that have silos, usually 2 to 6 silos right next to each other. That's the marker that you can tell that it's an asphalt plant. For what it's worth, those are called silos, unsurprisingly, and that's where asphalt that has been just made sits in storage waiting to be dispensed. Now, you'd think that you'd have to use asphalt as soon as it's made. That's actually not true. You can use asphalt that was made as long as, say, 3 days ago if the storage is airtight. Now, there's some cost to that, and it's not the one you think. So it's actually not that difficult if you have these big thermoses to keep the asphalt hot. Like a thermos, like if you've had a thermos and brought soup to school when you were a kid, the thing's still hot at 2 p.m. So is asphalt. The problem is that the longer that the asphalt stays hot, the less flexible it becomes because the light ends of the oil that give it its flexibility get burnt off. And the more that happens, then the more rigid the binder is, and that makes it harder for the binder to coat the rocks and harder to get compaction. So that's one of the reasons why the average distance is only 13 miles, in that you have to have asphalt be hot in order to get it compacted. And so if you get the travel distance too far, by the time you're using it, the temperature has dropped too much. And then you either have a poorly performing road, or you have to put a lot of pressure down, which can be difficult to manifest. Okay, to our decision. So I said before what decision we made. We went mobile first, and I'll get into the development side. I think this is the biggest learning lesson for me. So we went mobile first, so we designed our web app as if it was an iPhone app that we would like to use. We went web first, so we basically don't even think about the native app experience. We just say, hey, if we build a good mobile web app, the rest will be fine. We have a responsive design, so this is also used on desktops and takes advantage of the larger screens, and it's distributed via the App Store and Google Play. I'll talk about the development process we use in a minute. So before that, so why are some roads made of concrete and others made of asphalt? That is true, but most roads are not made of concrete. And I appreciate the answer, by the way, because this is fun. Well, cheaper at least in the first place. Yeah. Yeah. So convenience wins in most things. Like this is one of those, oh, time up? Yep, that's true. Yep, so concrete's very hard to cut. And so if you have utilities underneath the road, which any city does, and you put concrete down, you will regret it. On the point that you made before, yep, so it is true that concrete lasts a long time. It's also true that it's more expensive to put down in the first place. And it's also true that it's sort of inconvenient to work with. So asphalt is kind of this gooey mess that you dump onto a road and then compact into whatever shape you want it to be. So if you're on like a running trail and it's paved with asphalt pavement, it'll wind and go around roots and all that stuff because it's a liquid, back to the pitch drop experiment idea. Whereas concrete is not that, right? Concrete is made of cement and, I mean, like asphalt, it's a binder, which is cement in that case, and an aggregate, which is similar to the smaller rocks, but similar to what's used in asphalt pavement. But unlike asphalt pavement, it's a chemical reaction that then creates a new thing, which is concrete, which is why it's so hard and you kind of can't undo it. Whereas asphalt never really becomes a new thing. It just is a mixed up and squished version of its constituent parts. So yes, most 93% of paved surfaces are made of asphalt pavement. Only 7% are made of concrete. Those 60% of interstates are concrete. And that's because they take massive load and they don't change. And they're extremely controlled production environments. So it kind of makes sense, right? You'll have your specialized thing that's harder to work with, that lasts a long time, take on the heavy load, and everywhere where there's lighter load and you need more convenience, asphalt wins. And in fact, I think that the convenience winning bit is actually true for, it's true just for its own sake. In other words, since asphalt is better to work with, I think it wins even when the math may say it shouldn't in some cases. Okay, to the development. So we faced 4 main challenges after we decided, and some of these sort of persist to this day, after we decided to go with this one app to rule them all, built for the iOS App Store and Android's Google Play. So the first one, and I think this was the biggest one, building an app that feels right on a phone is non-trivial to get right. And I don't know what it was, but there was something about having our app as an iPhone app that all of a sudden caused me to see it differently. Like things that felt fine when it was a website that I was using on my phone, all of a sudden didn't feel fine anymore when it was sort of built and marketed as an iPhone or Android app. So examples of that would be like tap targets have to be bigger. Small tap targets on an iOS device it just feels strange. It feels like a website that's on a device. The navigation, it sort of has to be that stacked nav where you can go up and down a hierarchy pretty easily with the pages sliding left to right, or else it didn't feel right. And figuring out all those idioms for native development and porting them over to the framework that we had for our app, I think was the single hardest bit. Now I think what's interesting about that is that that's actually not unique to hybrid apps. I mean, that's a problem that exists already if you never were going to build the app for iOS or Android. It's just that for me, I didn't experience it as a requirement to get that feel as a native app right until we had decided to sort of market this as an iPhone app. And it took us a bit. I think it took a couple months to get the kind of building blocks of our app into shape that felt right as a native app. Second tough thing, the Corber config. So Corber is the library that it works for Ember and React and Vue. Getting the Corber config and build process right, it's kind of opaque. I don't really understand how it works that well. I don't personally, nor does anyone on our team, really have a ton of experience in iOS or Android development. So if things go wrong, you can get yourself in jail pretty quickly, or at least it feels like that. It feels like chanting a little bit. If I like stamp my foot and clap my hands and wiggle the right way, it'll work. And if I don't, it doesn't. And I don't like that feeling because I'm used to knowing how things work in Ember and Rails, and I feel like I don't know how things work in that world. It's not that big of a deal. I think in the end we got over it. It hasn't had huge consequences, but it feels uncomfortable. 3, the native app release process is sort of ridiculous. I mean, if you're used to building web stuff and deploying it and then have to deal with that, it's just dumb. But I don't know. That's sort of what it is.
No worries. Go ahead. Whenever you're ready, if you want to try to share your screen, and we'll see what happens.
Was that my subconscious that was just talking about? Is that what? Okay. But lastly, and this isn't a challenge, it turns out if you build a solid mobile-first web app with Ember, the native app just comes.
Perfect. And if you want to go ahead, I know we just did this, so you may not be ready. If you want to make sure that's full screen in the window.
This is,
yeah.
I'm going to miss the punchline, which stinks. So the punchline is if you build a solid mobile-first web app with Ember, the native apps come for free. Like you just don't have to do anything else. And you should have been concerned with these, or especially the first one, making an app that feels right in the first place. And I feel like it's this unknown secret that if you've done that and you have an Ember app, you have a great iPhone and Android app already with a little bit of chanting into the to the Corber gods. That's it.
And have the talk.
Okay, almost done. Are all dump trucks the same? No, the big shock here. In fact, some dump trucks aren't even dump trucks. This is a dump truck, in fact, a very popular type of dump truck, that doesn't tip at all. It uses a conveyor belt on its bottom. So sometimes you'll see trucks that look like this. They have like a V shape to them. And those are called live bottom trailers. And they're probably the most, I'd say the best kind of dump truck, even though they're not the most prevalent, because when you have the conveyor that's moving the material instead of gravity from tipping, it turns out you can control it a lot better because you just have a little joystick. And you don't have the risk of tipping over, which exists when you lift up the bed of a dump truck or hitting overhead lines or the rest. So no, they're not all the same. They differ on axle count, bridge length, composition, the dump mechanism, as I just mentioned, and shape, whether they're V-shaped or barrel-shaped or whatnot. Okay, so how did it work out? It worked out great, like really great. One, we maximized our leverage, and that was the point. That was what we were going after, is to maximize leverage. Could we get the most bang for the least effort, and we definitely got that. It was on budget, which is great. It was low risk, which I think for me mattered as much as anything. We were dealing, aside from the Corber stuff, we were dealing with technologies that we're expert in. So we know how to build Ember apps. We know how to build the Rails app that provides the API. We know web technologies. All we had to do is learn this one little incremental thing, Corber, and frankly not even learn it that well, and we got the rest. It did enable differentiated functionality and still provide significant option value, and then now we have these native apps, we can deploy other capabilities that take advantage of the device's native capabilities. This is an example of something that came out of the work, which I think is pretty great. So this is a chart that shows where a given truck was relative to the job site and the plant at any given time during the day. And it does the work to figure out, okay, 19 minutes moving, 23 minutes waiting, color codes it. So we're able to build these live monitoring capabilities that are taking advantage of all these drivers running the app on their phone that are totally differentiated, and it wouldn't have been possible if we did this. So what does it cost to move a ton of asphalt from the plant to the job site? The same as a venti caramel macchiato. Now, true story, I had to ask our oldest kid what a venti caramel macchiato cost, and she knew right away, which was terribly disappointing. So the answer was a little bit more than $5. And I looked it up, and for a typical job that's, say, 13 miles from the plant to the job site, about the best you can do in terms of cost per ton is a little lower than $5, which is kind of unbelievable that that's all it costs to move a ton of hot asphalt from the one place to the other. But, Starbucks is a good business. That's the point. Okay. So lastly, what are the implications? Well, first, you want to wear both hats when you're making this decision, not just the coder hat. And I know coder, so dumb. Programmer didn't fit right, so coder, So you have to wear both hats. So, you can't just wear the coder hat and say, which would I like to do if I had infinite time and infinite resources? Well, of course you'd like to make sort of bespoke apps that took advantage of the frameworks that are native to each platform. Of course that's what we'd want, but we do not live in that world. We have objectives, we have limits, we have, and those objectives aren't about sort of these ideals. So know your situation and objective, accept your constraints, you can't violate certain things. And then evaluate those options we talked about in the context of that situation and your objective. And if you do that, it's got to be 95% of situations that the folks in this room would be in would pretty easily lead you to say, let's build a solid mobile-first app using Ember and deploy it out to iOS and Android using Corber instead of embarking on this parallel, parity, multiple app strategy that almost never ends up working out in terms of providing enough resources over time to maintain that parity later. So thanks for listening to me, and if you want to chat about it, I'm around. It's one of my kids in the bed of a truck, or in a truck, doing that, you know. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Sean.